Good morning. Ayin Beis, volume 3. We are on page 1301. Okay. So let's review what we've learned, just to refresh myself and all of us. So the central theme, of course, is the interface between the divine and existence. That's the central theme of Ayin Beis altogether. But specifically here, from the beginning of volume 3, the Rebbe Rashab was dissecting and analyzing the verse. So after a rather lengthy explanation of most of that verse, all the way to the last two words in volume 2, volume 3 began with the last two words, Einoid. That Einoid emphasizes the ultimate final connection, the final frontier, where we connect the very Keli, the very darkness, the very state below, that it itself also reveals the divine, not just reveals Oir, but it reveals, in the language we've been learning, the Helama Atzmi, the core concealment, which is even higher than Oir and Gili on its own. So it's not just the Keli to Oir, in other words, a container that is channeling and drawing down energy. The Keli itself is a divine expression. And that's through the hard work of all the years of Aveda that help us refine, that refines this Keli and repairs it and elevates it to the point that it could not just reveal all the Giluyim and all the revelations, but it reveals the very source, all the way highest levels of the divine, even higher than Oir. And that is expressed also in the verse, Havaya Yechata Merivav, that the opponents of Havaya, which, as we learned, is Gvura. Even Gvura is Kadeshis, even holy severities or judgments challenge Havaya of Zah, and the response comes from Havaya de Leila, that's higher. Firstly, in Keser, that's higher than Chesed and Gvura, all the way before the Tzimtzum. So it eliminates these opponents, and more importantly, it transforms them, which is the ultimate, transforming them, sweetening and transforming them. As he began explaining more in detail on page 1298, that we still need to understand how we transform the kateger into the saneger, that the prosecution should be transformed into the defense. And that requires going up to these higher levels, not just to eliminate, which is one level, but to go even deeper and to transform, like tshuva does, transforming the zdeinus, the transgressions, the deliberate transgressions, into zachis, into merits. And that's the meaning vayitan oiz lemalka vayorim Keren meshicha, as we explained, that firstly the elevation of zah, which is oiz lemalka zah, to be elevated to the level of Keser, and then Vayorim Keren Meshicha, that Malchus, which is ultimately the lowest level, Meshicha. So the Vayorim Keren, the etzem of Malchus, should be elevated all the way to its essential source, which is all the way into Atzmus Ein Sof, as we learned in the previous pages. And that's where the Bas, Biti, becomes even greater. The daughter, which is Malchus, becomes greater even than Imi, than the mother. So it's not just the elevation of Zah, of Malchus to Zah, which is Achesi, or Imi, which is Bina, mother, but all the way up to Keser and even higher. Now, what is that in Aveda? That's Avedas Ha'eved. Bas is the work of the servant. So though on a Giluyim level, a revelationary level, a revelatory level, the servant is lower in the hierarchy than the Sar, which is the minister who advises. And why? So even though it's lower, however, on an essential level, it's actually rooted in a higher place. And that's the bittul But Etzem Mahuse, his entire bittul. The Sar, the minister's bittul, is only with his intelligence. With his faculties, he's completely dedicated to the king. And the Eved is all the way to the highest levels, and that's why his prayer, like you said, Rabbi Chanina ben Desuk was able to achieve the healing down below, changing reality below, more than Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, as Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said, because Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is compared to a minister, Sar l'fnei HaMelech, a minister before the king. And Rabbi Chanina ben Desuk is like a servant before the king. And that avoid is mamata l'mayla, from the bottom up, the work of the Eved in Birur HaNetzutzis, in elevating, in separating and refining and elevating all the sparks, including the divine soul, the animal soul. And that creates the transformation. That I'm just looking at the bottom here, the Nasav, okay, Malchus. So now I've reached the top of page 1301 rather, where he speaks about the Avodah of the Neshamas of Ban. Okay, Atzmus Ein Sof. So the last thing we learned was the new paragraph on page 1301, where he qualified and said, 1 second now, you're telling me the Berurim reach all the way to these highest levels, but didn't we learn earlier that the man, which is like Lechem min Hashamayim, the bread from heaven, which is L'mayla mi Berurim, is higher because Berurim only reach the energy that goes into Islapshus, which manifests within existence. And the man draws that energy beyond that, beyond existence. So the Rebbe Rashab answered that there's two separate things here. Yes, the man has that power. It's an energy that's higher than the energy within existence. But so we're not talking about the pure level of energy that is generated, because in Giluim, yes, man is higher, like we learned. Just like the minister is higher than the servant. But the servant reaches all the way in the Etzem, because that's where the Berurim reach, because that's the whole purpose of something that's even deeper than revelation. And the fact that the Berurim draw down a form of Islapshus, he called that Seder v'Hadrage. That's the orderly progression rather, by level by level, because that's what you need to do. To be able to elevate to these highest levels, you have to go step by step. And in that sense, it's a Seder v'Hadrage that Nimshachesh b'chinas Islapshus. That was up to the parentheses. So in other words, there's two aspects in Berurim. Number one is that it refines the container. That's what Birur does. That's what the whole point is we live in this world, in a world full of containers which includes our eating, our drinking, our daily routines and activities, our work. And step by step, we refine that. And we make the keli, the words that he uses, the refinement and the repair and the priming of the container, that the container shouldn't just be a coarse and a coarse and a crass entity, a yesh, but the keli should become refined to be able to be a keli telekus. So when you eat something l'shem shamayim, that's a perfect example for it. But then there's another thing that's happening, and that is how the Berurim themselves in this lowest level is touching and reaching the very purpose of existence, which goes all the way up higher than Ur. The Kavanah was, Ur is only a revelation of the divine. The purpose of all is all the way in the Etzem, the purpose of making a Dira B'Tachtenim. Though he doesn't use that expression here, he used it earlier. And that reaches Etzem. So there's the process, and that goes step by step, Seder v'Hadrage, and then there's what it ultimately reaches in quality, that deepest place. That is what we've been talking about, Atzmus Ein Sof. Now, the parentheses we learned, and I think we came, I believe, to the end of the paragraph. In the parentheses, I'm going to sum up what we learned in the parentheses, where here he explains, what does it mean by Seder v'Hadrage? When you say that the Berurim are in an orderly and in a progressive fashion, Seder, the organized and step-by-step elevation, what does that mean? So he says, the Seder v'Hadrage who bebeis in yanim. That is in two ways the Seder v'Hadrage manifests itself, expresses itself. So let's go over these two ways now. The echad is this, that a kolzman, as long as that the keli was not completely nizbarer, completely refined to be a keli lekus, so then it's only in a state of zichr. It's only in a state of zichr, which means you're refining it, but it's not completely yet transformed a keli to lekus. And the goal is she'ein nisaris pselis beiklal. The goal is to refine. There shouldn't have any mix of any waste pselis. And we said that meant pselis dak yeser. A pselis, even a waste of that, is very subtle. So this causes the keli. That's how the keli, so to speak, goes up from one level to the next level, a higher level. And he compared it to the difference between inyani reshus and mitzvahs. A mitzvah becomes literally a keli telekus, because the mitzvah, God says, use this cloth, this parchment, this skin, this hide of the animal becomes parchment for tefillin or for whatever mitzvah, or the same thing with an esrig or any other mitzvah. So there it becomes, like he calls it, keli mamish lalakus. Keli mamish. But in Yana Rishus, it's not, the batter itself is not becoming a keli. It's being used for something proper. And like he brings from the Tanya, Lamed Perek Lamed Hey, that when it comes to mitzvahs maisius, actual mitzvahs, koyach haguf mamish shabasiyazu, that the power in the body that's doing this action, whatever mitzvah it may be, is encompassed in the divine energy and its will and is completely yichud gomer, united with it. We read it inside of Tanya. The same thing with the keich nefesh hachayunis shebeguf mamish, which means the power that the body has to act, not just that action, but the entire keich hachayunis. And the same thing with the actual physical items like tefillin, they become kelim to meichin dezun al derech kelim datzilus. But in Tanya he says the neshama of a tzaddik, not, in other words, independent of the mitzvahs, is a yesh and kelim of biyah. And he said in the parentheses, this is even talking about neshamas of atzilus. There's still a form of yesh v'davar v'fnei atzmei. Why? Because the neshamas have separated from atzilus to come down to this world. So they're aligned with godliness, but it's not like quite like a mitzvah, like we discussed in chapter 5 and 6, 4 and 5 in Tanya, that Torah mitzvah always remains one with godliness because it's God's ratzon. So for sure, so from this we understand that the same thing is with Inyan Rishus, that they're not better than the shamas, that they're not united quite like a mitzvah itself is. So what do we see from this? The Seder V'Adroga of how the keli is refined step by step until the point where it'll be a keli mamish, but it needs to go through all these stages. That's why you see with Rishus, you don't just become a keli overnight. It takes time, it takes work, and it's not quite like a mitzvah. So that's the first meaning of Seder V'Adroga, that it's an orderly process, and as long as it's not completely refined, you can't call it a complete keli. But then he said there's a second aspect to the Seder V'Adroga, and he says that's the ikar, v'hua ikar, and that's the primary meaning behind it. That the level of Avdi, who abira the shem ban atzmei. I'm reading now the second part of closer to the bottom of page 1301, the end of the paragraph. That the Avdi, which is of course the work of Birurim, working with this material world, is the bir of Shem Ma Ban Atzmei. It transforms the very existence of the world, and that's why its bittul is be'etzem u'husa yesh yeshem Shema, because Shema is like an energy of bittul of oir that's affecting the keli. Here, it's the Shem Ban itself is being refined. So Seder V'Adroga Shaykh Ba'abir Da'or Shema Mevarer. When we say Seder V'Adroga, that you can say when you're talking about the Shema, which is the oil, the energy, like the neshama is refining the body. There you could say that it's only a zichruch bavad, like we said before. It's not a transformation; it's refining step by step. That's in an orderly fashion. But the Shem Ban itself, the very fact that you're transforming the world, that's a qualitative shift. And that's be'etzem hayesh, be'ena be'inyan deseder v'adraga. And it's not in a form of an orderly fashion. So we learned this pretty quickly last time, before we finished the last time we learned. So I'm going to go over this and read this inside a little slower now. I think that makes sense. But that's the last piece we learned. That we learned to the end of the paragraph, but we learned it quickly. So I'm going to read this a bit slower now. So this is the second meaning in Seder V'Adraga, the second element in it. And that is that it primarily refers to how ma is mevar ban. But aval bitl, I'll start from aval bitl, the shem ban atzmehu be'etzem hayesh. It's not the energy is shining on matter and refining it, but it's a refinement from within the yesh itself. That's what Avodah Sa'eved does. The Avodah of a minister or a ben, you can say what he spoke before about Shem Ma, like Moshe Rabbeinu, also refines the body. He said Moshe's body was refined, but it was more Mamayel Lamata. It was because the Neshama was so powerful that it even affected his body, like he said on the previous page. A bitl gam begufe. But it's still ma. It's driven by neshama. It's not like driven from within. Similar to what we spoke about shuva. Shuva means that you were, God forbid, a person transgressed, and he transforms the transgression to a merit. That's not like a tzaddik who never transgressed. That's where the oyer, the energy, is illuminating even the body and the physical world. But what a person, when a eved, however, is immersed, engaged in material matters, and that's what he uses to, and that's what he refines. That's the bir hayesh atzmei, what he calls. So let's just use the words here. Avla bitl the shem ban atzmei. You know, I'll read even actually. Let me start from the Ayin Beis. I'll start from a few lines earlier. The Ayin Beis, the second Ayin in the Seder V'Adraga, who for who iker, and that's the primary. The b'chinas avdi hu abir the shem ban. Avdi is the work of the bir of shem ban, engaging with this world, not just like a Moshe Rabbeinu that's from above shining below, but engaging mamata lamayla, like he said on the previous page, from the bottom up. Shem ban atzmei. Ben Elazar Habeis, the Shem Ban Poel Habitl Be'etzem Husa Yesh Yeser M'Shem Man, M'Shem Ma, that Shem Ban causes the bitl in the Etzem Husa Yesh more, in the very core of the Yesh, of the crass matter, more than Shem Ba. The Seder V'Adraga Shaykh Ba Bir Da'or Shem Ma, Shem Ma Mevar, V'Inyan Zichruch Bolvat. The Seder V'Adraga applies more to the birra ora shema. That refines, that does the refining. And that's the zichus bovad, meaning, like you said earlier, it cleanses, it refines the keli. Ukamay ba'aveda shal pitam v'das, like a veda that goes in an orderly fashion, that's a rational aveda based on contemplation, that's rational. So when a person contemplates ungodliness, and convinces and is able to also engage the animal soul in that, that's shazel b'seder v'adraga. That's in an orderly fashion, through meditation, through contemplation. Avla bitl the shem ban atzmei, but the bitl of shem ban itself, which is immersed in the material, hu be'etzem hayesh, is in the very core of the yesh. Be'ena be'inyan the seder v'adraga, and it's not subject to the regular orderly fashion, because you're dealing here with a qualitative shift. Now, to say there's no order at all is also not correct to say, because you also need Shem Ma. Like when a person, for example, is learning Torah, the Torah that you're learning is also refining your mind and your heart and the animal soul as well. But it's much more orderly there because it's coming from Shem Ma. When you're dealing with this, with the very matter itself and transforming it, there's something that requires some type of a leap. Because what you're doing is like I said with tshuva, you're dealing with the very I don't call it the enemy, but like the heart, the belly of the beast, the heart of materialism, And that is be'etzem hayesh. So you really need to break the yesh. And that's not quite b'seder v'adroga, like he says. And the final point, which is critical here, when you finish that job of refining that yesh, is that the yesh will be transformed to a very increased state of teiv, where the shem ma that's mevarer also reveals a goodness, but it's not quite as it comes from the thing itself when you transform. Eliyahu shem ban, not like Moshe. Moshe's his body did not become an angelic, like we'll learn in a moment. Or like we learned earlier that Moshe's body, little bit gufay. What did he say? Did he say about his body? No, he didn't say it there. He said it here. Okay. So he says like that. Eliyahu, that his very body became like an angelic. That's why his body went up as Sarah Hashemayim in the heavenly wind, because his very body was able to became spiritual. Not just as a keli to the oyer, which is the Seder V'Adroga. The keli becomes a keli, like we learned, like we discussed. The student expands his containers. He's able to contain more of the intelligence of his teacher. Here we're talking about the transformation of the very container itself. Like the body of Moshe, which was nizen, it was nourished from the spirituality when he went up on the mountain, when he went up to heaven. He was a keli l'dvar Hashem. He was a receptacle, a transmitter, and a channel for the word of God. Even though that this has a tremendous quality, it's still called a keli to something greater than it. That's why by Moshe, in contrast to Eliyahu, his body did need burial. His body did not go up as is, because he wasn't the transformation of through Shem Ban, it was through Shem Ma. So yes, his body became a complete transparent channel to Oyer, but it's not the transformation of the Keli itself. V'hainu, and this means the Begmara Berurim, that the conclusion of all the work over all of history, there's a great quality, there's a superior quality in the refinement of Shem Ban, Mashayesh Atzmei Nepach Latev, that the very Yesh itself has been transformed to goodness. And this is the inyan, not that the Keli is a Keli le'oir. It's not just a container to energy. It's not just Havayu Alakim, that Alakim, the Keli, and the Helam is transmitting Havaya as a Keli Tavaya, but it itself becomes Nepach Latev. And this is the level that Dafka, this level goes all the way to Atzmus Ein Sof, which is the Vard, which we're going to Vayoram Keren Mashiach, Malchus, going all the way up to its source. As shall be explained more with God's help, the Inyan Keser Shem Tov, She'ela al Gabeim, the crown of the good name, Tov, Keser Shem Tov, is greater than all the others, goes above the Keser Teira, Keser Kahuna, Keser Malchus. As I mentioned, but below they say that this piece is not found in our Hemshech, which means, I'll confirm that as we learn it, but since they're writing it, let's assume that's the case, that this would have been something the Rebbe Rashab would have written later, but he didn't end up writing it. Okay, with that concludes the parentheses, the second meaning in Seder V'Adroga. So here it's far more of a qualitative and quantitative thing in a way. In the first interpretation, it's not, and by the way, it's not too different. He says Beis Inyonim. There's two Inyonim, meaning two elements, two aspects to this, when you say orderly versus beyond order. And the first was, we said, is because it's primarily due to the fact that it's going in an orderly fashion because you're not refining completely. And the second point is that Shem Ma is primarily orderly, where this transformation is a qualitative, like a quantum leap or a paradigm shift. And that's what creates this transformation. That's the Ikar, as he says. And with that, we conclude the parentheses. and the summary. So before we continue, maybe any of you want to ask anything or clarify anything, I'm happy to do so.
I heard in your My Life class this past weekend that you checked I think you checked, it was referring to this, you checked the manuscript to find where the end parentheses was found. Is it correct here, or did you find
I didn't check it yet. I didn't check it yet.
Okay.
Well, right now it's right here. There is and the parentheses ends right here. I was just wondering whether maybe not, but it's perfectly fine if it ends here as well. And I would assume that's correct. First I thought maybe it was higher up, but I would right now, for all practical purposes, say it ends here. I'll check anyway, just to double check, but I think it's correct to say that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. And any other questions? Okay, so let's continue. I'll start with the next paragraph, the bottom of page 1301. The pages can be found at ayinbeis.com. So here's what he says. So now he's going to go back to what he began. If you go back 2 pages, 1299, when we spoke about Vayitan Eis L'Malke, that was Zah, the elevation of Zah. Vayoram Keren is the elevation of Malchus, which is what we just finished learning about. So now he's going to take us back to that. So it stopped. If you look at the bottom of page 1299, he said, Vayoram Keren Mashiach is the elevation of the Keren of Mashiach, the Etz Atzmis of Malchus, which is the level of Bas, Rani V'Simcha Basian, Bas, and all this was an explanation of Bas, the Eved, as it elevates to even higher than the minister and higher than Imi. He says there, L'maylam b'chinas Imi. Which actually earlier when we learned about this, Imi was even higher than the ministers were compared to Achosi, sister to Zah. Imi was the Mashpia. And here it's even higher than that. Okay, just for the record. So now he goes, and this is also the inyan of the end of the verse of Avay Yechat Merivov. So it continues, and it says, Vayitan Eis L'Malke, he gives strength to his king. Vayoram Keren Mashiach, and he elevates the Keren, the crown, the Keren, the Etzem of Mashiach. So the Rebbe Rashab is now going to explain more in detail what does this verse mean, what does the word Keren mean. So far we learned Keren means Atzmi, and also the word Oir, like Kadmi Heit Panov. So back on bottom of page 1299, he said Keren. I just want to see it before we. Etzem, and then he said Keren Mashiach Atzmi Shalom Yibchinas Gilui Mamush. And he wrote Keren there with a quotation. So he says like this: Dehine b'chinas Keren, dehine b'tevas Keren. Sorry, dehine b'tevas Keren. In the word Keren, the Hebrew word Keren, yesh kama pirushim. There are a number of interpretations, and he's going to spell them out. I believe he's going to spell out 3 interpretations, if I recall. Actually, 4. 4 interpretations in the word Keren. Ha'alef, loshen teikef v'chezik, kirama karni. From the word teikef, strength, or intensity and strength and power. So teikef v'chezik, Keren refers to something strong and powerful, like Rama karni. V'torem kereim karnoi. So what do you say? And another, Tremam Nakarni Sadik. So in all those verses, you see the idea of the elevation or the celebration, if you wish, of the strength of that level. Keren karne is like the keren, the horn of the antlers of a re'em is not a reindeer. Re'em is a
Elk.
is it elk? Is it re'em elk? I don't know if it's elk or maybe even not a buffalo. I think keren. But it definitely refers to something of power and strength.
A bull.
What is re'em?
A bull.
A burro?
No, a bull, like a bully.
Oh, a bull. It could be it's a bull, but it's a bull with horns. It's not a moose. I remember looking it up. If you look it up, you'll see what an aim is. Okay.
Rashi is saying that the aim is a very tall animal with a lot of karnaim. It said about Yosef.
Yeah, but what animal is it? What's the English word for the animal? That's what I was looking for. Okay. And Treimam Karnis Tzaddik. That the crown, the karnis, the strength of the tzaddik should be elevated, exalted. Ubezehu gamkein, this is the first interpretation. Ubezehu gamkein keren hayevel. When you say the keren of the yevel, of the jubilee, there's the keren. So remember, keren also is a, like this pach and a keren. A pach is like a small crucible, and a keren, when they used for anointment, a keren was like a horn that was used to anoint a king. So the Keren Hayevel, he's saying here, the Chezek Vizgabus Ubezel Gamkin Keren Hayevel. I'm not sure. I'm second. I correct myself. I'm not sure what he means by Keren Hayevel here. What's the context of Keren Hayevel? I remember. I think because I see from the next line, he's saying like this: the chezek v'izgarbus habal chai, the power and strength of an animal who bekarnov is in his antlers, in his horns. We see when these animals they use their horns to fight, the horns symbolize their strength. You see it also in mating and so on. The horns are a symbol of their power and strength. So what do we see from this? That the word keren is teikev v'chezek, power, strength, intensity. That's the first interpretation. I'll look up Keren Hayevel. I have to look it up. What's the second interpretation? The one he said before on page 1299. Habeis loshen etzem.
Yovel is an ayil. Is a ayil.
That's what I thought. Yeah. First I thought it was Keren Hayevel connected to the.
So a Keren shofar meshubach from the ayil.
From a ram. It's a ram. Okay, got it. Okay, but in all these things, you see the power. What about Traimam Karnis Tzaddik? Tzaddik is not an animal, but yet he calls it Karnis Tzaddik. Okay. The strength of the Tzaddik. Fine. The second interpretation, meaning in Keren, is Loshen Etzem, the core. Hainu Atzmus Hadover, like the very core of the thing, meaning the core essence of something. Like it says, Be'etzem HaYem Hazeh, and Targum Onkelos, the Keren Yema Hadin. He uses Keren, even though with a chaf.
Bichran, that's an Aramaic.
Aramaic, yeah, is Bichran Yema Hadin. Meaning in the, so why does he, but Be'etzem HaYem Hazeh, like when they went out of Mitzrayim, it means at noon, in midday, in the essence of the day, the most powerful moment of the day, or you say
Yoma Hodein. Etzem Hayem Hazeh, like you said. Hodein.
Yeah. So you see from this that Kran, which is Keren in Aramaic, is a translation of the word be'etzem. So that's the second interpretation. Kach kosev arashba al hamaymer b'chulin perek elataris. So Chassidus brings from this is from the Rashba. So in the Gemara in Chulin, in Perek Elataris, he talks about Keren Echad Hoyela b'mitzchay, that Adam Arishan, he had a Keren on his forehead. And everyone wonders, what does that Keren mean? Was it like a unicorn? I mean, what kind of horn did he have? So the Rashba teaches from the word Esem. Keren hoyela b'mitzcha. So that it means that he had some core dimension was there. The next page, 1302. Ubeloshen razal. What for example would mean an etzem? Etzem doesn't always mean etzem means the very core of something. So it says Razal calls it keren or peiros. We learned earlier. Remember, hakeren hakayemes le'elam haba. There's the principle and the dividends. So keren and peiros means keren is what let's say you invest, or the very core investment, and peiros are the dividends that grow out of it. So we see the word keren is the core of something, as opposed to the derivatives that come from it. Hakeren hakayemes le'elam haba, like we learned earlier. The elad vorim sha'odam eichel peirosein be'elam hazeh. These are the things we learned, kibbutav, and those different things we learned earlier, where a person eats from their fruit in this world, the keren kayemes and the etzem, the principle is preserved le'elam haba. So you see from this that the word keren is not the word strength, the word etzem. It's not a contradiction. It's just the meaning here is keren etzem. The etzem of the thing as opposed to its hispashtus. Another way of putting it, the core and its extension or derivatives, like we see here with peiros. So that's meaning number 2. Meaning number 3, hagimel.
What is pei aleph tes?
Perek elataris.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's in Chulin. Yeah. Hagimel. We're on top of page 1302. Hagimel. Loshen Zoyar v'oyer. The word keren comes from the word illumination, light, shining and light. Kikeren pnei Moshe. That the skin of Moshe shines.
Koram.
What did I say? Keren? Koran pnei Moshe. That the skin of the face, the flesh of the face of Moshe shined. Here, Koran means light. As a matter of fact, just as an aside, when Michelangelo painted the portrait of Moses, of Moshe, he actually has, or I don't know if it's Michelangelo, somebody, 2 horns, because they misinterpreted. They thought Keren means horns, when really Keren means light. His face was shining with light. That's why he needed a masva, like in this week's parsha. Hadalad. The fourth, okay, now comes the fourth interpretation. Loshen keren zovius. So keren zovius is also used when you talk about a corner. When 2 sides come together, it's called keren zovius. The corner of where 2 sides come together, where 2 sides meet, the corner of a room, keren zovius. Kamoi karnes hamizbeach. The corners of the mizbeach, when it says isru chag ba'avosim, at karnei hamizbeach, it says karnes hamizbeach, the edges. It could be called edge or the corner, the edge of the mizbeach, the edges of the mizbeach. Or another expression he uses, Keren ben shaman. Not sure where that's from. Anybody knows? Keren ben shaman.
In Sefer Yeshayahu, Kerem hoyo liyedidi bekeren ben shaman. It's in the
So
beginning.
it must be again an edge or a corner.
It means to say that it was a very beautiful vineyard in a saturated place, Keren ben shaman.
Okay, so it's referring to a location, to an area. Okay, so there we have 4 different interpretations in the word Keren. And now he's going to begin with the 4th one. He's going to explain the 4th one, and then he's going to come back to explain Vayoram Keren Mishiche, what that means. One second. Who came here? Just 1 second, please. Okay. So he says like this now. V'hinei, and now Keren is obvious. Keren is obvious, the edge or the corner where two sides come together. Hu hamachaber beis kaislin or ksalin kaislin. It attaches and connects two walls. So let's say you have an east wall and a northern wall. So the northeast corner connects the eastern wall and the northern wall, just as an example, Mizrach, Svenis, or whatever other corner it may be. It connects two walls. Okay, he actually uses here southeast. Okay. The Keren Dremis Mizrachis, Keren Dremis Mizrachis, and the southeast corner, who's obvious. So those are the edges. He says like this: the two. Behind the snake solim hamischabrim biyachad, oz nikra zovius shebehem keren. Which means that when two walls connect together, then the place where they connect, the place where the walls connect, the zovius, where they meet, shebehem, that's the keren. Oz nikra zovius shebehem keren. So if one wall did not connect with another, you wouldn't have the word keren. Keren is when specifically when two things connect to each other. So he says the zovius, the shebehem, the oz nikra zovius shebehem, the walls, that's called keren. Ubelechi burim yachad, and when they're not attached or connected, kasher kol echadu b'fnei atzmei, when each wall is separate, ve'ena mischabri makesh la'sheni, and does not attach with another wall, the second wall, ozei ena shayach shum zovius b'shum echad mehem. There, you can't call any type of angle. What's the word zovius here? You can't define them as a meeting place because they're not meeting each other. What does the actual word zovius mean? When you say Keren zovius, Keren is the corner where they meet. Zovius means the two sides, I'm assuming, right? What's the root of the word zovius?
Yeah, two sides, two edges together.
Yeah. Who's zovius? Those are the two sides of that. So therefore, you can't call them as the inishach shum zovius. There's no sides. B'shum echad mehem. Rak nikra, when they're not connected, nikra could say shu asav v'sim shalakes. All you could say is the end. It's the end of the wall. Let's say the eastern wall came to an end. The end and the conclusion of the wall. Shezeu hagbolas hadover. That defines its boundary, its limit. Ki'im. But rather, but when the two walls attach or connect, the southern wall and the east meet yachad together, nothing is added to them. When you connect them together, when they meet, you didn't add anything, you just made them meet. So and nevertheless, something new was created here. The sides that meet in one place. So in other words, two walls, nothing changes in them. They're both, let's say 10 feet long. One wall. Another wall is another 10 feet long. But they don't meet, so they're two separate entities. Each one has its 10 feet and that's it. But if they meet, they don't become longer, but something new is added. They become connected, and that connection is called the Keren's obvious. The two sides have met. That's the new thing that's come. So he says like this. Actually, skipped the line. Let me read it again. I skipped the line. Rather, when the two walls, the southern and eastern wall, connect together, then in the place where they attach and connect, Neilad Zovius gives birth to Zovius, to the sides that meet, Keren Dremis Mizrachis, and that's the corner that's called the southeastern corner, and that did not exist when they're separate. So something new happened. A southeastern corner was born because simply you attached. By attaching them together, nothing was added. And nevertheless, even though you didn't add anything, just connecting them gave birth to something. Something emerged, and that's called the corner, the sides and the corner. The nimtza, what do we find? What do we derive from this? Keren Keren is not a separate entity, klal, at all. Ayin. It's a form of ayin. When you think of a corner is what is it? It doesn't occupy space. It's where one wall meets another wall. Nothing is added. It's not extra. It's not an extra inch even, not a millimeter. And yet there's something there. So it's the level in Chassidus called ayin. Sharikol masha nimshach kesel darim hu darim, because the wall, the southern wall, as long as it extends on a southern plane, that's called south. The kol masha nimshach kesel mizrach hu mizrach, and as long as the eastern wall extends, it's called east. It's not called Keren. It's called either south or east. Rak sheba memela. So what is this Keren? What kind of state is that? So he says it comes automatically, without any addition. The meischaber shnei advarim nela da Keren. So when two things connected, they give birth to something new. The Keren. V'lein is chesef kan shum dover. Nothing was added here. Rak hischabrus. Only hischabrus. Only the connection. The imkein hakeren hu hamachaber shneim yachad. So from this we derive that the Keren is that force that connects two different entities without adding anything. It's not like a fastener. You know, you can connect two things with glue or with some third item that connects two things, like a pipe, two pipes, and you need some type of fastener to connect them. With a Keren, it's not that way. Now we're going to explain what this is in Ruchnius. But before I continue, I just want to point out, just to make it a little more explainable, a little more palatable. The Rebbe brings this a number of places. There are three opinions. This is space. In time, we also have such a concept. It's called Ben Hashmoshes. Ben Hashmoshes means between day and night. That's why it's Ben Hashmoshes. So the Ragad Shavar brings that what is Ben Hashmoshes? Some say, one opinion is, it's a combination of day and evening. That's what it is. It's a mix of the two. It's like when the sun is setting, it's still somewhat light outside, like twilight. Ben Hashmoshes. Still somewhat light outside, but it's not. But it's also dark. You can see the darkness. So it's a mix of the two. Another opinion in halacha is that it is a separate entity. There's a thing called day, there's a thing called night, and there's a thing called Ben Hashmoshes. It's its own entity. It's not a mix of the two. It's a state of its own. And the third opinion is that it is like the corner, a Keren Zovius, that has no identity altogether. All it is where day and night meet. So it's not a mix of the two, and it's not a separate entity. It's only where they meet. Now it's the gay in halacha, because let's say someone is born Ben Hashmoshes. Was he born in a moment in time, or is he just born at the moment where day and night meet? If it's partial day, partial night, so certain halachas would apply, things that you're allowed to do by day or night. Let's say a bris, big issue. If a child is born Ben Hashmoshes on, let's say, on a Sunday, so when is 8 days from that? Is it on Sunday or is it on Shabbos? And makes a big difference, because Shabbos, only if it's a bris bismane, are you allowed to do a bris. If it's not bismane, you're not allowed to do a bris on Shabbos. So there's a lot of implications when you talk about something that happens Ben Hashmoshes. So the Ragad Shavar compares it to Keren Zovius, the third opinion. Keren Zovius is not east and not south. So it's not a combination of the two. When you go to the actual corner, it's not south, it's not east, it's southeastern corner. So in a Keren Zovius, it's the level like Ayin. It's not a mix of the two. It's not a separate entity. It's something that just happens when two things meet. It's the meeting point of two things, an invisible meeting point, so to speak, that's not measurable even. Just wanted to add a bit to that understanding. And it also, by the way, has halachic implications. Because when the Torah says it should be done, let's say, in the Keren Mizrachis, Dremis Mizrachis, means it has to be done exactly in the corner. It can't be done. It's not part south or part east. It's specifically in a place where two entities meet. That it's not a combination of the two, and it's not a separate entity. So there are halachic implications. But right now, he's going to, of course, explain the spiritual implications of this, and then go back to what means v'yoren Keren Mashiach, what this Keren means. Any questions, or else we can go straight to Adugma Yuvan. Okay. So he says Adugma Yuvan Lamaila. The example of this discussion about the Keren, this corner, will be understood above as follows: the Keren ubchinas Malchus. Keren is the level of Malchus. She'ena davar b'fnei atzma. It's not a separate entity. Why? The less la megarma klum, because Malchus doesn't have anything of its own. So it's not an entity altogether. Malchus is a completely empty entity that has nothing of its own, zulas, except for being Mashiach Siyum Atzilus Va'atik Lebriya, except for being the end of Atzilus and the Atik, meaning the top of Kesed of the next world Briya. So Malchus on its own is not an entity. It's the place where Atzilus meets Atik of Briya, according to what he's explaining right now. I know you can jump and say, 1 second, so what are all these things we learn about Malchus? That Malchus has chesed, has chochmah, bina, das. Malchus is dibur. I mean, there's so many things we learn about Malchus. I could just suddenly say it's like a corner that has nothing. So first let's learn it all, then we'll get back to it. But regardless, this point that Malchus less than megamah klum, that's what it means. You could ask the same question. It has nothing of its own, so how does it have levels within it? So first let's learn it, and then we'll understand more what Malchus, the role of Malchus. So Malchus is like that corner between Atzilus and Atik. That's what he says. V'hini yadua, and now it's known, the binyan ha-Malchus, that when Malchus on its own has nothing, but then there's a thing called binyan ha-Malchus. When we build Malchus, like we talk in the Aser Simei Tshuva, the 10 days of Tshuva between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we build Malchus, but there's the expression, the building of Malchus from nothing, turning it into something. So he says, so it's known about the building of Malchus, Lias b'chinas partzuf, to build it that it should be a partzuf, a structure. Nase rak mahates Malchi is the test viras de zah. That the building of Malchus, that it should be an entity, a partzuf, a structure, comes only from the Tes Malchus. The 9 Malchus is what we say in Rosh Hashanah, the 10 verses that refer to God's kingship. And what do they correspond with? They correspond with the 9 spheres of Zah, not the 10th. Ki b'soid sheidish netzala rak nekuda achas b'chinas keser Malchus. Okay, I need to explain this a bit here. I need to explain this. Seit Shedish is an expression in Kabbalah. There's Seit Shedish and Seit Teisvis. Like we learned before about Keren and Peris. Shedish means when something is created, its very kernel or seed can be one thing, and then Teisvis is what you add on to it as you develop it. So it says about Malchus, all other spheres were created as an entity. Chesed did not begin to say Shedish as a Nekuda. Chesed has a full personality. Malchus, it says, in its root, all that emanated was just one point. Basically, a point that doesn't occupy any space. Whereas all the other spheres have an actual space or identity, which is called B'chinas Keser Malchus. So if you think about the moon, if the moon in its new moon state, there's nothing there, it's one Nekuda, which you don't necessarily even see. That's the moon in its purest form. I know that came after Miyut HaLevana, the moon was diminished, but we're talking now the moon after that state. So Malchus is B'Seit Shadish, only one Nakuda. Then Binyan Malchus is, you start shining into it and building the Tes Sfiris that he said from Zoh. So that's what he says here. B'Seit Shadish, it's only a Nakuda Achas.
Tes Sfiris with Zoh.
Ulechein, Kishetzricha, Lachze, Ponim Beponim, Nasis Nakuda Tachas Yisod. And that's why, as we learned this earlier a bit in Kabbalah, he speaks about that when Malchus is uniting with Zoh and needs to be face to face with Zoh, think of Zoh as the Mashpia, the sun, and Malchus is the moon. When they need to unite with each other, so it's called, Malchus becomes like a Nakuda Tachas Yisod. Comes like a point that's beneath the Mashpia, the Yisod, which is the end of Zoh. Yisod represents Zoh, and Malchus is only like a Nakuda. Lefishatz Musa, he b'chinas Nakuda, because the core essence of Malchus is selfless. It's Ayin. Because ultimately, Les Lo Megar Klum means that it has nothing of its own, it has no ego, it has no identity. Its whole identity is only what it reflects. So that's why its essential nature is, like he's going to say, like a Keren, it's not a Metzius B'fnei Atzmei. It's complete bittul. That's the point here. Lefishatz Moshe b'chinas Nakuda, the nivnis b'partzu sholem b'eses sfiris metes malchi is the Zoh. And then from this Nakuda, you can build upon and give it body and form and identity through the tes malchis, the 10 kingships of the 10 spheres of Zoh. Sholem b'eses sfiris from the 10 malchis of Zoh, from the 10 kingships of Zoh. Which means, v'hainu, Malchus the Chochma, the Zoh, Nasa Chochma Sheba Malchus. From the Malchus of Chochma of Zoh comes Chochma Malchus. Malchus the Bina the Zoh, Nasa Bina Sheba Malchus comes Bina of Malchus. So basically, that's how Malchus is built up. The B'chinas HaMalchus Sheba Chol Sfira, B'chinas Seif V'Siyim the Chol Sfira. The Malchus in each Sfira, Chochma, Bina, and so on, is the end level, the end and conclusion of every Sfira. The Hainu B'chinas HaGili Shalom. That means the revelation of that Sfira, Commission is Bar Liel Dibra Maskel Vayiga Shalov. We learned in volume 2. And now comes in parentheses. And then I'm skipping the parentheses just to get to the end of the sentence. V'nimtza the B'chinas parts of HaMalchus Ein Ischachas Dover. So from this we understand it's not a Ischachas Dover, the parts of Malchus. Sharizeu rak B'chinas HaMalchus B'chol Sfira. Okay, I have to be brief about it. We'll have to learn it more tomorrow in detail. So even when Malchus is built, it's also not a Chiddush, because it's coming from the Malchus in each Sfira, which is what builds Malchus. So firstly, Malchus itself is a non-entity because it's complete bittul. And even when you do build it, it's also being built from the Malchus of each Sfira. So at the end of the day, there's no real Chiddush in Malchus. It's not like a new entity completely. It's just drawing from the Malchus of each of the spheres. Now, there's plenty of qualifications I see here, but I see it's longer parentheses that need to be explained. So suffice it to say, we just read the opening line and without much explanation. So I'm not going to explain it right now. I'm going to stop here and we're going to go back to learning it inside tomorrow and elaborating. And then coming away and understanding how Malchus is like a Keren that just joins two entities, but it itself is a state of bittul and ayin. But I see that we need to read it more slowly, slower, and in more detail, and that is going to take more than 2 minutes. So I'd rather just stop here, and then we'll go back and relearn this piece. So we learned about what the 4 meanings of Keren. The fourth one being like a corner, and how Lamaila, that's going to be the level of Malchus, a corner that connects 2 different entities, but doesn't have any identity of its own. And then we'll go back to V'Yorim Keren Meshiche and understand how that explains everything we've been learning. So I'm going to stop here. If you have questions, great, but don't ask about explaining this piece because that we have to learn inside, obviously, and we haven't. So.
What is tes spheris the zo? Tes Malchus the zo. Zo is only Shisha and Malchus. What is tes Malchus?
In Zoh, there's Chochmah, Bina, Das, Chesed, Gvura, Teferes, Netzach, Chod, Yesod. That's the Tesfiris within Zoh. So Zoh has Chochmah Sheba Zoh. He says it specifically. He says it. Chochmah Sheba. He says Malchus the Chochmah de Zoh Nasa Chochmah Sheba Malchus. So the 10 spheres are the 10 spheres in Zoh. In Midas, there's Moichin Sheba Midas, and there's Midas Sheba Midas.
Zoh itself is having Esa spheres, each one of them. Chesed is having Esa spheres. Gvura, the whole entire Zoh is one entity also that is having Esa spheres.
Yeah, because as a part of this Chochmah Sheba Zoh, there's Bina Sheba Zoh, there's Chochmah Sheba Chesed, there's Chochmah Sheba Gvura, but then Zoh as a part of there's Chochmah Sheba Zoh as a general entity of Zoh. If you break it down, it's Chochmah Sheba Chesed plus Chochmah Sheba Gvura plus Chochmah Sheba Teferes, all the way to Chochmah Sheba Yesod. But overall, it's called Chochmah Sheba Zoh. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? I see he's going to explain all of this more in detail, so we have plenty to go here, I see.
Meanwhile, he's relating only to the last Pirush of Keren, Zovis. The first few Pirushim he is not talking about, right?
So far, right? That's correct. I think he's going to, I don't know, I have to look further whether he's going to talk about the other. He talked about Etzem earlier, and a little, he mentioned Oyer. So he briefly did mention it on page 1299. I'm not sure if he's going to go back to it. I'm looking right now, as a matter of fact. Okay, so let's stop here, middle of page 1302.